Good evening from South Africa, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those joining us from other parts of the world. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the official T20 South Africa 2025 side event, titled Unlocking Trap Capital for Sustainable and Inclusive Development. My name is Elias Chikoto. I'm the director and founder of Zariro Consulting, as well as Southern Africa lead for Resilience Capital Ventures. On behalf of Dr. Gillian Marcelle, founder and CEO of RCV, and in collaboration with Dr. Philani Mthembu of the Institute for Global Dialogue, it is an honor to open today's session. As the official engagement group of the G20, the Think 20 or T20 plays a vital role as the ideas bank of the G20, bringing together leading thinkers, scholars, and practitioners to shape evidence-based policy recommendations. Under South Africa's 2025 G20 presidency, T20 South Africa is this year placing special emphasis on solidarity, representativity, and inclusivity, ensuring that voices from across the global South are heard and valued in shaping the global development agenda. Today's session contributes directly to that mission. It builds on the recognition that finance and capital allocation are not merely technical issues. They are deeply linked to justice, equality, and self-determination. Our theme, Unlocking Trapped Capital, speaks to one of the most pressing challenges of our time. Across much of the developing world, billions in financial, social, and intellectual capital remain trapped behind structural, institutional, and cognitive barriers. This is more than a technical discussion. It is part of a broader effort to reimagine capital. Over the next 2 hours, we'll hear a keynote address from Dr. Gillian Marcelle, followed by a distinguished panel of practitioners, investors, and policy leaders who will share concrete pathways to redirect capital flows where they are most needed. Our discussions will explore how to make finance work for development, not the other way around, how to build enabling ecosystems for inclusive participation, and how to shift mindsets and reform institutions so that capital truly serves people and the planet. Allow me to express my sincere appreciation to the T20 South Africa Secretariat and Dr. Philani Mthembu for their partnership and leadership. Time Africa, our media partner, for helping extend the reach and impact of today's dialogue. And most of all our panelists, discussants, and participants joining from across the world. Your insights and engagement are what make this session truly meaningful. With that, I thank you all for joining us, and it is now my pleasure to invite Dr. Philani Mthembu, T20 South Africa co-lead and Executive Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue, to deliver the opening remarks. Dr. Mthembu is the Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue, an independent foreign policy think tank based in Tshwane. Prior to joining IGD, he pursued a joint doctoral program with the Graduate School of Global Politics, Freie Universität in Berlin, and the School of International Studies at Renmin University in Beijing, China. The focus of his dissertation was on the rise of emerging powers as sources of development cooperation in Africa, for which he was awarded magna cum laude. He recently published a book titled China and India's Development Cooperation in Africa, The Rise of Southern Powers, and has co-edited several other books. With that, I hand you over to Dr. Philani Mthembu.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and welcome to this official T20 side event. Colleagues, I think this engagement obviously takes place during the week where the T20 South Africa, which is convened by the Institute for Global Dialogue, the South African Institute of International Affairs, and the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, are preparing for the T20 summit, which takes place in Johannesburg in a few days. And so we looking forward to welcoming members of this T20 ecosystem to South Africa in a culmination of the work that has taken place throughout the year. The G20 presidency has essentially been defined by the key themes of solidarity, equality, and sustainability. And as we know, South Africa's diplomacy has once again been tested with the world's attention firmly fixated on the country as it navigates geopolitical storms in the midst of growing pressure on multilateral institutions. South Africa's approach, despite geopolitical tensions, some of them directed and misdirected specifically at the country, has been one of inclusivity. And so even amongst South Africa's fiercest critics, South Africa has continued to extend an arm and continue to open the door for engagement. And I think this has been the approach throughout the year. It's also showed the importance of strengthening relations amongst middle powers in the global north and in the global south throughout South Africa's G20 presidency. Indeed, middle powers have an important role in shaping a geopolitical landscape experiencing fragmentation. South Africa has, during the course of the year, by the end of it, would have hosted approximately 130 working group meetings and 23 meetings at the ministerial level. And some of the priorities that have defined the presidency have included inclusive economic growth, industrialization, employment, and reducing inequality. Issues of food security have also been important, while artificial intelligence, data governance, and innovation for sustainable development has also been important. Now, the T20 plays an important role within the G20 ecosystem. And of course, South Africa is at the helm of the Think 20 in 2025. And building on the progress made by previous presidencies, the T20 has prioritized diverse perspectives to foster inclusivity and collaboration and to bridge geopolitical divides. The T20 bolsters South Africa's G20 presidency by bringing together leading thinkers from across the world. They collaborate within 5 dedicated task forces, focusing their expertise on some of these themes: trade and investment, digital transformation, financing for sustainable development, solidarity for the achievement of the SDGs, and accelerating climate action and the just energy transition. Now, this ecosystem of the T20 has worked in partnership, and if you see a lot of the outputs, policy briefs, policy notes, various blogs that have been put, and a number of side events, they have emphasized collaboration between the Global South and the Global North. And we see that 1 year after the UN Pact for the Future, and a few months after the United Nations Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development, it is clear that innovative approaches are needed to advance the development of Africa and the Global South, especially in an environment where traditional development cooperation and financing is under strain, as leading countries in the world reprioritize development financing towards military expenditure. We've also seen the importance of reforming multilateral development banks. We've also seen the importance of building up the capabilities of tax administrations across the developing world to finance development. But also some of the discussions have looked at the importance of rethinking the informal economy, pension funds, and of course, insurance reforms, while also addressing the issue of illicit financial flows. And what is clear in the communique that the T20 handed over to the third Sherpas meeting earlier this year is that if we are to address a number of the challenges that we face in contemporary geopolitics, it becomes absolutely important to rethink the manner in which we finance development. And so today's side event, Unlocking Trapped Capital for Sustainable and Inclusive Development, certainly makes an important contribution in the work of the T20, just a few days before the T20 summit. And with that, colleagues, it's an honor for me to introduce our keynote speaker for today. And I'll just go through a little bit of her bio, which will emphasize why it was important that we have an engagement with her, because I think throughout the work of the T20, we've been ensuring that we get the perspectives of practitioners and scholars throughout this year that South Africa holds the G20 presidency. Now, our keynote speaker is Dr. Gillian Marcelle. And Dr. Gillian Marcelle leads Resilience Capital Ventures, a boutique capital advisory practice specializing in blended finance. Dr. Marcelle developed the Triple B framework to improve flows and allocation of capital in its multiple forms. This provides a platform for engaging in the finance and investment world, where her contributions and perspectives on diversity, inclusion, accountability, and alignment with the SDGs have become influential. Most recently, she was recognized by Earning Inclusion in the 4th annual Forbes 50 over 50 investment list. And her decades-long track record includes attracting investment and structuring deals. Her sectors of focus are telecoms, fintech, renewable energy, regenerative agriculture, and health systems. And her speciality is the design and implementation of blended finance strategies that involve partnerships, ecosystems strengthening, and architectures to facilitate transformational change. Dr. Marcelle includes among her clients and partners the government and peoples of the Bahamas, Open Society Foundations, MPC Energy Solutions, Policy Link, Marine Agricultural Land Trust, Africa Bio, and the Clinton Foundation, as she serves on the advisory board of New Majority Capital and has guided numerous ventures in the role of senior advisor. She's also an LP in Outside Ventures. Now, given that the T20 is being held and led by South Africa, and the G20 presidency being led by South Africa and will be hosted for the first time on African soil, it's important to also emphasize that our keynote speaker is quite familiar with the South African and the African context in her work, having also led capital markets work for JP Morgan, for the Telkom SA IPO, and the financing of MTN. She's also served as an associate professor at the Wits Business School for 8 years, during which time she designed and led a postgraduate research and teaching program on innovation management and supervised quite a number of MBA and MM research reports. She's also led the Center for Science, Technology, and Innovation Indicators at the Human Sciences Research Council, which of course South Africans are very familiar with, as a member of the senior management team. And so she does have that, familiarity with the South African landscape. I mean, I could go on, but, I think it was important to highlight that besides the global experience, this is also somebody who's worked quite closely within the South African context. And she will be delivering the keynote address, which will be followed by a panel discussion. And so, Dr. Marcelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon and good morning, colleagues. Sawubona, molweni, dumela. Comrades, friends, colleagues, and any family members that might be listening, I bring you heartfelt greetings and my shared delight at being able to be part of the G20 by making this contribution to the T20 for the first time that the G20 has come to African soil. South Africa is a magical place, a place of miracles, not only because of its outstanding natural beauty, but because of the diversity of its people and their brilliance. South Africa truly is the cradle of humankind, a site of emergence, liberation, and nation building. The vanquishing of legalized apartheid was not a victory only for South Africa, because freedom-loving people around the world were excited and drawn in. And so I come to you in 2025 with the fervor of a student who began my activism in the South African anti-apartheid struggle. In this presentation of Unlocking Trapped Capital, I will address the thorny and vexed problem of chronic underperformance of the financial and investment sector. Economic statistics and observed lived reality tell us, show us, that hardworking Africans, the elderly, our young people, and budding entrepreneurs are not being well served by the status quo. Financial capital is trapped and must be unlocked so that it delivers optimal value to society. Together with my colleagues, some of whom I've known since 1996, I will explore the multiple dimensions through which capital is trapped, including structural, institutional, and cognitive barriers. But we will not stop at diagnosis. In my discussions, I will introduce a construct, the BBB framework, that I believe is key to moving us beyond chronic underperformance. We will take a journey to understand how to get more capital flowing. And to do that, we first must say a little bit about where we are now. First of all, as everyone on the call and in the audience will know, our human family is facing a series of interrelated and layered challenges. These range from the obscene levels of wealth and income inequality, where small numbers of people have more wealth than billions, to the degradation of the natural environment and extreme weather events. Our planet is warming after a century of industrial production and distribution that has fouled the atmosphere. There is no aspect of life that is unaffected by these interconnected systems. For billions, life is brutish and harsh, with deprivation of basic needs, while at the other end, there is a spectrum of the ultra-wealthy enjoying material riches and excesses. African lives are lived and livelihoods secured in such a challenging context. To achieve prosperity and further well-being within these difficult macro conditions, our countries must show their mettle. And that's why the brilliance and the resilience of the South African people and all of continental Africa and global Africa becomes important. Africa does not represent a large percentage of global GDP. In 2025, the African GDP stood at $2.1 trillion, representing only about 3.6% of global GDP. African Economics reports that perceptions of Africa have remained stubbornly unchanged. The cost of access to capital in Africa is more expensive than other developing country regions, despite our best efforts. Not least because credit ratings agencies are mispricing African securities, whether they be fixed income or otherwise. Faulty methodologies, bias, and poor relationships with sovereigns has led to a ratings challenge. There is concern from my colleagues that the attacks on preferred creditor status of institutional capital providers, the development financial institutions in the region will make this access to capital problem even worse. However, that's only one side of the story. The continent is blessed with abundant natural resources, including vast reserves of critical minerals. Africa is also the fastest growing population on the planet, with the potential to deliver an energetic, dynamic labor force and engaged citizenry. We can play a part in the world. Africa's total population is estimated now to be 1.55 billion, and no one knows what the population of Nigeria actually is, so we know that that estimate is probably an underestimation. We do know that Africa's population in all countries is growing at an estimated rate of about 2.34% per annum, which means that Africa's population is likely to double by 2070. Colleagues and friends, the world is becoming more African every day, which provides an opportunity to introduce our rhythms, philosophies, style, and verve to the rest of the world. This means that even if we still hold generational trauma caused by transatlantic slavery and the difficult period of European settler colonization, it's having a dwindling effect on our collective and individual psyches. Africa is here and has an important contribution to make. Africa is already doing big and bold things, setting up trade and economic blocs like the AFTA, an initiative that once implemented really has the prospect of being truly transformational. Personally, I'm very proud to see Africa also re-embrace or embrace once again a spirit of Pan-Africanism. I think that many of us get to live a Mbeki experience of having Africa within us, even when we are not physically there. Colleagues, friends, family, these are complex realities. I engage with them as Desmond Tutu called us to be a prisoner of hope, determined to continue to fight for the next stage of liberation, which is one in which Africa can enjoy economic vitality and human thriving for all. Financial capital and other forms of capital are an invaluable resource for Africa's liberation. There can be no human thriving and planetary stewardship without dramatic and fundamental improvements in the finance world. To bring it home to South Africa, I still have a home in Parktown now, North. So this is personal. We will not solve the human challenges faced by our people: structural unemployment, service delivery crises, inadequate infrastructure, failing education systems, high crime rates, gender-based violence, without money. But conversely, we know that money is not enough. The late Howard Richards, an eminent philosopher and economist, was preoccupied with the vexed problem of securing sufficient financial capital to satisfy current and future needs without having the economic system work only in the interest of capital. at the expense of labor and other factors of production. To this end, he offered models that put community and dignity at the center, theorizing that humans would offer labor services into the commons not only for pecuniary rewards, but to gain skills, to derive connection, and to improve self-esteem. The Presidential Employment Program, inspired by Howard Richards, led ably by Kate Phillips and others, is a success story of non-conventional, paradigm-breaking economics at work. We can do it. And so in the rest of my remarks to you, I will speak more directly about the ways in which Resilience Capital Ventures, a boutique capital advisory firm based very much in the global north, works to dismantle the prevailing narratives around what finance is meant to be about, so that we can reshape it, reimagine it, so that it serves people and planet more effectively. So with that, I want to go into a structured presentation where I speak to the BBB framework, as well as the dimensions of trapped capital and what we're going to do about it. In the BBB framework, there are three important components for you to think about and recall and consider. The first is bottlenecks, which are the barriers that slow down or hinder capital mobilization and capital deployment. There are many different types of bottlenecks, and we will speak about structural bottlenecks, processual bottlenecks, and cognitive bottlenecks. Cognitive bottlenecks are so important that the BBB framework actually identifies them as a specific component, which is blind spots. There are many different types of blind spots, and psychologists have done lots of work around this, but we look at the ways in which blind spots, the way that investors and other participants in the investment ecosystem simply do not have a full and holistic view of the situations and settings in which they are investing because of groupthink, homogeneity, and bias. And when the global private capital markets are structured as they are, heavily concentrated in the global north, heavily concentrated in Wall Street, it means then that these biases and blind spots actually have a material effect. And so the third component of the BBB framework is the reimagining of finance, so that finance works better when you include and sequence in other forms of capital, non-financial forms of capital, such as knowledge, social capital, cultural capital, relationship capital, and network capital. This is very important in terms of getting finance to not be harmful. And in the next slide, we show exactly how the process of combining the forms of finance that many of my colleagues would be familiar with, public sector finance, private finance, philanthropic finance, with the non-financial capital, produces something that we call BBB blended finance or BBB blended capital, which works better. Why does it work better? Because the understanding of the setting is part of the investment process. And in the next slides, we will show that this comes about through the work of activators and ecosystem builders. So in the work of the alchemy of combining financial capital with non-financial capital, some of the folks who are on this panel play a very important role because, as Elias said, finance is not only a technical subject. And so the work of ecosystem builders like Amma and like Diana is very critical in terms of making sure that the high finance techniques of Caesar and Tshepo and Ntlai and Ulili actually work in the way that it is intended to deliver improvements in lives and livelihoods. So that's the Triple B framework in short. What I wanted to move now to is spending time with you, understanding how we apply the Triple B framework to dimensions of what it means to have trapped capital. I want to talk about at least 3 dimensions of trapped capital, which I think will resonate well with this audience. First, I'll begin with the structural and processual bottlenecks that represent a major hurdle for all of us in Africa. I'll give you some statistics to land this. African pension funds, insurance companies, and sovereign wealth funds collectively hold about $2.1 trillion of assets. That sounds like a big number on its own, except that all of global private sector capital is around $450 trillion. So it means that African pension funds, insurance companies, and sovereign wealth funds are really only a small part of the global private capital that is available. And so there is an issue of scale. If the issue of scale were the only thing that we had to solve, we would just get more of that institutional capital. But sadly, this pool of capital is also trapped by policy, regulation, and investment strategies that see the balance sheets of our institutional capital pools used mainly to buy government treasuries. One figure from the African Development Bank reports that 80% of the investment of our pension funds, insurance companies, and sovereign wealth funds is used to buy government treasuries. I don't know whether that is domestic treasuries or US treasuries, because that would even be more interesting. When that pool of capital could be being deployed for priorities such as roads, ports, airports, railroads, water systems, and of course, energy. Clearly, colleagues, this is something that we must fix. That entrenched and persistent gap is also made more difficult because the funds and the pool of funds is small because Africa also has a really high gap in terms of insurance coverage and retirement savings. We are underinsured, and there is only a small percentage of the overall population that has retirement savings. This means that the first priority must be growing that pool of capital and also strengthening the domestic capital system so that you have a much more imaginative use of those institutional funds. We are hopeful that those kinds of changes are possible because we are working on these issues every day with colleagues like the ones that you will hear from in the panel And also, we were able, in much smaller settings and jurisdictions, to get access to those institutional funds for clean energy investments. The second aspect of trapped capital that I want to address are the cognitive bottlenecks or blind spots. This is a difficult subject, colleagues, and so I'm glad that this is a safe space, because the cognitive bottlenecks and blind spots in finance arise because of elitism. Finance and investment, like technology, science, and engineering, is an elite occupation and profession. The exponents of finance and investment are highly trained, educated most often to tertiary level, and the population skew towards A-type personalities that are extroverts. That's not a problem in and of itself. What becomes problematic is that the values in operation in the global finance sector are those of a global elite concerned more with materialism than with solidarity. This is a community with a propensity to be attracted to high risk in terms of the psychological profiles, to put an emphasis on personal gratification, to be concerned with prestige, status, and perks rather than community enhancement. Recruitment processes are intense, and so the status quo draws people of like mind into the sector. Workplace culture then ensures that that is the culture that is supported and retained. Around the world, success and leadership in finance and investment is coded to be Western, white, and male. It therefore takes enlightened and thoughtful navigation and a bit of chutzpah and luck for global Africans to enter this world without losing one's soul, purpose, or mission. I talked with one of the panelists about what it took and what it takes to be in this world with our integrity intact. Investing with a BBB framework lens enables us to identify and name these cultural biases. Because as a feminist, I know that what isn't named cannot be dismantled. We do not flinch or shy away from naming the combination of whiteness and toxic masculinity in the finance world, because we truly believe that this is the first stage of reshaping finance and investment to better serve global Africa and all people. When it comes to an intellectual lock-in, we know that finance is not a particularly academic or theoretical field, and so it borrows very closely from neoliberal economics. And so you have a combination of two-story ignorance: neoliberal economics as a theoretical foundation and a toxic culture making a stew. But I am not in any way deterred, because to liberate finance and investment from these shackles, we require and we use the poetry of Langston Hughes, the lyrical fire of Miriam Makeba, and the revolutionary insights of Steve Biko. We've got this. Economics is now being taught as an echo chamber rather than as an adventure. And in my LinkedIn advocacy, I remind people every day that not because they were not well taught does it mean that the economics discipline cannot be a space of expansion. We do that so that when we undertake transactions, we're doing it drawing from well springs that include structural economics, heterodox economics, feminist economics, development theory, so that what we bring to the boardroom is wider than an economics that sees human beings as only price takers and the purpose of an economic system as being only profit maximization. Colleagues, that is far too narrow and harmful a view of economics to be fruitful. The final dimension of how capital is trapped that I want to get to is the misalignment of the capital stack. The folks who you will be hearing from represent the best in technical high finance, as well as in ecosystem building. BBB investing operates at a technical and granular level, as well as at the level of poetry and philosophy. Because we understand that having the conceptual and intellectual commitment to change is not enough. I've been doing finance since I was 24 years old. Systems change is a contact sport, and therefore we engage in change through how we do transactions. Every encounter with a source of capital and fellow change agents is an opportunity to make finance and investment work better for people and for planet. The selection of collaborators for this session and for the work that we will be doing on unlocking trapped capital going forward is itself an enactment of systems change. Resilience Capital Ventures unlocks trapped capital through our direct engagement with capital providers. So let's talk through some examples. There is a lack of investment in key areas that represent the true wealth of Africa. Those pools of capital that we talked about should be deployed in agriculture, critical minerals, benefication, infrastructure, energy, housing, and so on. But that's not happening. The key point from a TBF investing lens is that Africa must not be a source of unprocessed raw material or a pawn in geopolitics, but rather a strategic owner of its resources that are stewarded for the benefit of her people. The pace and the extent to which this is possible depends on our technical competence. We cannot do finance and investment well if we are still having to parachute in experts to do it for us. Africa needs investment. In 2020, the infrastructure budget for East Africa was around $8.4 billion. Inward investment coming in to the West African region was around $22.3 billion. These are statistics from a group called the Infrastructure Financing Trends in Africa group. Those statistics only tell half of the story, simply because being able to deploy that capital in ways that bring about value also requires expertise in risk management, in having a network of capital providers, in being able to match capital sources and capital providers, and to do that well. You will hear a number of those examples from my colleagues. From an RCV point of view, what we have been able to do and the way that we have learned by doing is through our work with the government of the Bahamas and the Bahamas Sustainable Investment program, which is a multi-year investment program that is designed to bring about benefits to the people of the Bahamas by investing in a strategic way and also improving the investment infrastructure as part of the investment project. We have been fortunate to secure catalytic capital from the Open Society Foundations to be able to do this project. And this is therefore a demonstration of why the sequencing in of catalytic capital is so important, because it allows us to do the work of engagement with capital providers in order to secure capital for this facility. The Bahamas Sustainable Investment Facility is intended to be in the $200 to $500 million range. And of that, a considerable portion is for sustainable investment infrastructure, docks, bridges, and seawalls, some of which were damaged in Hurricane Dorian and so require to be rehabilitated. Colleagues, let me begin to wrap up by emphasizing a few key points. The BBB investing as an approach to unlocking trapped capital has focused on three key aspects or key dimensions of how financial capital is trapped and the ways in which non-financial capital, political capital, social capital, cultural capital, relationship capital is used to make financial capital work better. We are optimistic because of the work that we've been doing ourselves. The early work that we did with our client, MPC Capital, which allowed us to bring a credit union into a structure with a private equity fund, which had never been done before in the Caribbean region. But we are also optimistic because of seeing colleagues in developing countries in Asia, and here I'm thinking specifically of the Impact Investment Institute led by Dureen Shanaz, under the umbrella of an orange economy and an orange movement, doing work to bring investment capital to developing countries in Asia with a gender lens. I'm also excited and optimistic because of the focus that has been placed within the G20 on mainstreaming gender justice into what the B20 was doing. And my colleague at Standard Bank leads, Lindeka, deserves full praise for the way that she championed that agenda, as well as the other leaders in government and in civil society. The message is one of possibility and the need to be determined and consistent in doing the work of opening up trapped capital. My colleagues and collaborators will provide many examples of innovative financing structures that can be used to open up institutional capital and have it work with ecosystem better. They have the sectoral knowledge, the high finance expertise that is necessary to have structures that use domestic currency financing, that have structures that integrate with de-risking using techniques from the insurance industry. And we also have ecosystem builders who understand that the finance and investment sector is not outside of society. We must bring it within society so that we apply legislative and policy reforms to change any structures and processes that are impeding progress. Unlocking trapped capital for sustainable and inclusive development is an imperative. Financial and non-financial capital must be accessible at scale to Africa, and in other developing countries. If we do this, and it is possible, we will succeed in promoting and making progress in human thriving and planetary stewardship. We will provide this community that has shown interest in a finance and investment topic in the context of development with many, many more examples of how we can improve risk management, how we can design structures, how we can change the pricing of debt, how we can improve ecosystems, and how we can move money into infrastructure and critical minerals. There are Africans on the continent and in the diaspora already doing what is needed. We are honored to work alongside them, bringing our own expertise, intention, and track record. As a final word, we invite your continued engagement as we unlock trapped capital, paying attention to these three key principles. One, good governance. We have to do the unlocking of trapped capital so that capital is available for people who need it most and not only for individual enrichment. Groundedness. We must maintain a clear-eyed focus on our collective why and have regular feedback loops to check in with each other and make sure that we're still in alignment. And then the final G, the final principle. We must do this with global Africa in our gaze, because Africa is about embracing a cosmology and a worldview, not a physical space. I am Africa because Africa is within me. Thank you very much. And we are just about to start a process of unlocking trapped capital that will serve our people for generations to come. Thank you so much. And I believe that I'm handing over to the panel. No, I'm handing over to Elias. Thank you so much, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marcelle. Without further ado, I would like to introduce us to our moderator, who will in turn introduce the panelists. Diana Gichaga, who is the founder and managing partner of Private Equity Support, PES, a Pan-African woman-led enterprise support advisory firm that has worked with SMEs and nonprofits from across 26 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. PES provides pre-investment advisory across various sectors, including climate resilience and sustainability, renewable energy, agriculture and nutrition, and water and sanitation. Diana, I hand over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Elias. And we are really excited after that wonderful keynote speech from Dr. Gillian, Marcelle. And as we're getting into the panel, I thought it's important to just pick a few things that the panelists will be leveraging on just to shed more light based on the discussion that Dr. Gillian said. The first thing that came out strongly was the fact that we need to reshape and reimagine how we are using capital to address the blind spots that she has mentioned, whether it's structural, whether it's cognitive, and whether it is to address the other aspects of misalignment that are very evident in some of the examples that she has given us today. And what I liked about that is she said the questions, the answers to those questions are within us. And the panel today is just a small microcosm of that larger population that is skilled, that is doing the work every day to actually address some of these challenges. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to the panel discussion after such a wonderful keynote speech from Dr. Gillian Marcelle. And the way the panel will flow is I will do a very quick introduction of the panelists, give you a very brief background, and get right into the discussions of how we are using all this means and all this activity to address this barriers, to unlock that trapped capital through various ways. And the key ways that we will be looking at this, or the themes that are guiding us, are how we can unlock capital through expertise and through skills, how we can unlock capital, specifically institutional capital that is meant to do significant de-risking of several opportunities on continent. And of course, when we think about the SME side, what we are doing in venture capital on the continent and what we are doing to strengthen the support that we are giving to the MSMEs that we work with. It is my absolute pleasure to then introduce you to the speakers that we have today. We have Ntlai Mosiah, and he is the Executive Director of Autonomi Capital. They are an independent financial provider of financial and strategic advice, and they specialize on matters to do with energy, infrastructure, and the resource sector. And he's currently the managing principal for the Mazi Infrastructure Fund, equity fund that is domiciled and working in South Africa. We will also be joined by Cesar Siwale, who is the CEO of Pangaea Securities, and he has been in the leadership role of Pangaea since 2005. He has extensive experience in the African financial markets, having led transactions across various sectors, including those of mining, energy, telecommunications, and financial services. He will be supported by Tshepo Magagane, who is an executive director at Pangaea Securities and a partner at the Critical Minerals Fund. He has been playing a strategic role in facilitating investments into mineral projects across Africa. He's also a natural resources investment banker, having over 2 decades of experience and extensive work across sub-Saharan Africa and major financial centers. We will also have Ulili Onovakpuri. She is a venture partner at Motley Fool Ventures, who have been investing in growth stage companies that have at least $1 million in annual revenue. As a previous managing partner at Kapor Capital, she helped raise and deploy over $126 million through a fund that was focused on early stage impact-driven startups, and we are very excited to hear from her. We also have Amma Gyampo, who is the CEO of the Ghana Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, GVCA. She is an international development, ESG, gender, innovative finance, and philanthropy advisor who has a focus on market creating innovation, strategic communications, private capital markets, impact investment, and entrepreneurial ecosystem building. So please put your emoticons with the clap or the thumbs up sign so that we know you're still there and you're very excited to hear what our panelists will say. So allow me to first engage with Ntlai, and specifically what we would love to hear from you, Ntlai, hearing what Dr. Gillian has spoken about, the issues, the barriers that are limiting how institutional capital can be a catalyst towards a significant change that we need on continent. What would you say are some of these barriers that you're addressing through your work at Autonomi Capital, and what opportunities lay in terms of how to better work with institutional capital? Over to you, Ntlai.
Absolutely, absolutely, Diana. Thank you very much. And Dr. Marcelle, always a pleasure to serve with you and the other esteemed members on this panel. So, as mentioned, I come from an investment banking background, having spent 15 years at Standard Bank, which is one of the largest banks on the continent, and certainly the largest by assets. And without retracing some of the steps that Dr. Marcelle spoke to so eloquently, one area she mentioned was that the capital stack, right? So in our role, when we look at institutional capital, which is what we are trying to bring or have successfully deployed, and that's the key thing. It's not just about bringing it, because the institutional capital exists on the continent as well. So there are certain points of friction that make it seem like this is all about capital from the global north into the global south. And that's part of what we want to be able to dispel, to say institutionally, across that capital stack, we do have other non-liquid forms of capital that have to come in, other than the more social capital, so financial capital. So we need to access certain insurances. That's very important. And a lot of our work, that might be ECA, Export Credit Agency from overseas, but also domestically, certain insurances are important to be able to support part of that more financial capital that comes in. So that's very important. Guarantees, and Africa starting to see actually a much greater proportion of guarantee type of facilitation to support the liquidity that is coming in. And then when we start looking at the pools of capital, financial capital, governments play a key role. In South Africa, where we are based, and Autonomi works across sub-Saharan Africa. Governments often have large budgets, and often a lot of this capital and money that is inside those budgets goes unspent and returned to the fiscus. And that again indicates that there's a certain amount of friction, whether it is proper planning, project management, or the readiness of the demand, the readiness of the projects, whatever it might be. And then the last is pension fund money. I think this was also mentioned by Dr. Marcelle, in local currency inside these countries. And even yourself, Diana, you're talking about Ghana and some of the reforms that have happened in this space. This is a very important conversation that we hope to be able to delve into in a little bit detail later on. The last one I want to talk about is probably just the technological innovation that is happening. And in everything we do, we should not be ignorant or sort of gloss it over, because the need to improve the rails through which capital is going into the country and being deployed into projects is very important. And we are now starting to see new technologies such as those which are blockchain enabled, that allow different sources of capital, such as digital wallets and crowdfunding. And anyone who's followed the stories of what's happened with people like Robin Hood in the United States, who's more like a broker, will just see the power of crowdfunding being able to actually turn against Wall Street and make Wall Street buckle down. So we've got to be thinking about some of these other mechanisms as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ntlai, with your very important insight. And I just really want to highlight a few of the aspects you've raised, because I think when CISA Siwale comes in to speak about what they're doing at Pangaea, it'll tie in very well with what you have mentioned. The fact that you've talked about improving the rails right, through which capital gets into the country. We tend to think of infrastructure as some amorphous structure or policy, but it's really something that is within our control, as you've mentioned, and something that we can leverage on, even blockchain, to get it into the country. Yes. Right. And I think the other thing that you have mentioned that is so critical is some of the barriers that are preventing this capital flow could be aspects to do with readiness of the projects themselves, could be aspects to do with the currency and the way the capital stack is structured.
Absolutely. And project prep funding is such an important thing. You know, a lot of the DFIs have got a lot of money into that. And we've just got to make sure that the deployment of that capital is resulting in bankable projects. So we're very excited about that, and it's something that should continue.
All right, thank you so much, Ntlai. And now this just cues us very well for Caesar. Caesar, it would be really good to just hear how the work you're currently doing is addressing some of these barriers that Ntlai has mentioned as critical to ensuring we are able to unlock that trapped capital. So offer to you, Caesar.
All right. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Early evening in SADC. So I see a lot of my SADC colleagues are very alert still, which is great. But you know, I should say the way I look at the journey that we've taken, you know, when I joined Pangaea in 2001, I was hired to do a $500,000 rights issue. And I look at the transactions that we're doing today, and they have significantly evolved. I think the largest transaction we're working on at the moment is 370 million. So there has been a significant shift in the markets, and we should never lose sight of that. And even though there's still difficulties and we struggle to catch up with the rest of the world, there has been progress. If you were to map this, you would see it in that journey. And over the years, we've actually taken the view that there isn't a capital scarcity problem in Africa. There's actually a plumbing problem, a gatekeepers problem. And we have always also taken the view that rather than initiating in that journey from the West and pointing at the West what they could do better for us, be it Wall Street, City of London, and so on and so forth, I would rather point at the guys just down the road from here in Lusaka. What a great job are they doing at deploying that capital? How much of that function are they outsourcing? I really love what Ghana and Nigeria are doing in liberalizing on the asset management side and creating new asset classes. Obviously, South Africa and Botswana have been at the forefront of that, and we've seen the results where they are. But overall, still, I take a very positive view that we've made a lot of progress in the last 30, 35 years. We started our firm's journey in Wisconsin. Two Americans came to Zambia to do the blueprint for the capital market in the early 1990s. We were a dealer broker working on a stock exchange in Zambia with 4 or 5 listed companies. In fact, my understanding is the first 18 to 24 months of creation of the exchange, they had no listed companies at all. So I don't know what they did for 2 years. And today we have a business that covers the SADC region with 40 to 60 members of staff doing different things. And our role is really being that enabler. We've got a team of very diverse, sophisticated Africans that are able to articulate themselves. They can hold their own in providers of capital. And we see us as the enablers and actually ensuring that what we facilitate for is not only generating a return on that capital that is being deployed into these assets, but actually also how many people do we take with us. That is very, very important. And I believe we have a duty that, you know, the large projects are predominantly driven by multinationals. And so we are the voice in those rooms to say the supply services that you get, you should work with the Africans in country. If local content is 10%, it is not a cap, it should be a floor. And if the Africans then can provide 30, 40%, use those skills. And if they're happy to hire us as the so-called boots on the ground and they trust that we can deliver, then there are certain services that we should trust that the communities that we live in would also be able to fulfill their role. Obviously, there's a great obligation that those guys carry because unfortunate for us, and I like to operate in the reality, the unfortunate thing for us is that when John Smith messes up, it's John Smith's problem. But when Mulenga Piri messes up, it is all the Africans that mess up. And so if Mulenga Piri is given an opportunity, then he should carry the day appropriately, that he's carrying many other people with us. And I've always taken that view, how we operate our business. And coming to the point at hand that I was asked to talk about, which is the Critical Minerals Fund. It's a very ambitious initiative. We're very lucky with Tshepo. It's an area that has got extensive experience on. And then we bring the framework in which we can do this. We are nimble. We are a small boutique business relative to the big players. But we also know that the big players, with the way the world has changed post 2008, it's like trying to turn a train or a plane. It is just very difficult for them with Basel III, IFRS 9, gray listings, all these crazy things that are there that the big banks are terrified of. Whilst we can work with different stakeholders, we can work with pension funds in country, we can work with the JSE, the Lusaka Stock Exchange, the BSC in Botswana, JP Morgan and others. And then we try and look for what is that challenge that is there that we need to address. So that for me is it's a very important space in terms of where we are today. And I like what was just mentioned earlier in terms of really how do you de-risk against currency. And some of it are some of these innovative products that are there. The reality though as well is in Africa, the central banks don't understand them. So you find in other certain jurisdictions, Bitcoin is illegal, right? It's still very challenging to use. And some of the views we're taking is even if local savings might be limited compared to a global stage, they say charity begins at home. So anchor those initiatives with domestic capital and then go regional, and then from regional, maybe go intercontinental. And that for us is the way that should progress. The unfortunate reality is a lot of the gatekeepers still lead from the back. And so you typically find that most of the initial capital you're getting is still international. Two important projects that we are working on at the moment, infrastructure transactions, which are opening up northwestern Zambia for ease of movement of critical minerals. We have actually seen for the first time that the African multilaterals, the African Development Bank, TDB, AFC, DBSA, IDC, I must give flowers to these guys. They led, the international DFIs that we all usually talk about. They said, come and see us when you have this nicely packaged, and you can talk to us then. And we had the African multilaterals hold our hand through that process. And that for me was really refreshing. And hopefully that is the start of more of those sort of collaborations.
Okay.
Maybe just sort of to wind up on the side of time, obviously. I touched on very briefly on the other elements in terms of taking everybody with you. So supply chain financing is very important. We've got an arm to the business that does that now. And we've seen, again, very effective where we provide wholesale, we secure wholesale capital, whether from the domestic banks or from the likes of TDB and other African multilaterals to deploy into these SMEs. Zambia just passed fresh local content legislation for the mining sector. We believe this is going to be a game changer. And we're seeing the mining companies actually being proactive that they meet the requirements of those of that legislation. But ultimately, my big thing here is African savings have got to build African assets, and then international capital comes in to complement. The so-called Africa risk, Tshepo and I were at an event 3-4 weeks ago, and we walked away feeling we were all Africans. We came across as if we were trying to convince each other that we are actually all investable. And so we've really taken this terminology, Africa risk, to new heights. And I don't know how to unpack it. Zambia definitely has got its own version of political risk. So does the DRC, so does Kenya, so does South Africa. But how do you make it specific to each jurisdiction? And then how do you make it specific to that opportunity that you're trying to unlock for? That's where hopefully we should be heading. And then international comes in to complement on our terms. Because if we start the other way around, we're building these institutions, these ecosystems on different terms where capitalism is first, right? So if we want other ideologies, which my colleague Tshepo is going to talk to with sort of with how do you empower these communities further, then we need to get how we deploy this capital right from a domestic perspective and then bring in internationals. And so I think with that, I would like to hand over to Tshepo, if it's for me to do, and he can speak to sort of the work that we are doing specifically in the mining space that you do take the communities with you. I will pause here. Thank you.
All right. No, thank you for that. And just before Tshepo comes in, there are certain things I thought it was important that we really pin for the audience today. And that is what you're saying, domestic capital coming in to de-risk the opportunities, so that the de-risking is done with the right proper context and understanding of what the actual, not the perceived risk is, which of course impacts what that cost of capital will be when you now invite international capital or other capital to come on board. And I think one of the key things that you have said is we don't have a problem with capital, we have a plumbing problem. Something also Ntlai noted, the rails that bring capital in. So it's really an issue of how are we going to unlock this trapped capital, because we do have sufficient capital to be able to do significant work specifically here on continent with local capital from the pension funds, whether it's in long life insurance funds. And as you said, once we do that, then we are able to make sure that, and this ties into the triple B framework, where we are saying it's not about the economic system maximizing profit. It's also about how do we make sure that this entire capital is going beyond that to ensure that we are creating sustainable growth. So Tshepo, it'll be good to hear.
Diane, just to give a very specific example on that, because it's a very important point you've raised. If I'm working on an infrastructure project in Zambia within the confines that the domestic capital can service, pension funds in Zambia are collected in kwacha, right? There should be no reason that that project should be priced in dollars, because effectively what you do is then you take the local currency, you buy dollars, that puts pressure on the currency, and then servicing it over the next 10 to 15 years, the project owner who's receiving kwacha for that particular infrastructure, they have to go in the market at every interval to buy dollars, to pay a local pension fund in dollars, who holds dollars for a temporary period of time, and then they convert to service their members. Why not? What is our fear that you can't price that project in kwacha and index it appropriately to the sovereign or whatever it might be? And then we can be ambitious when you go into the region. Thank you.
I really like that, because it relates to Dr. Gillian's question or remarks about the cognitivism of the barriers we have. We are so stuck in a certain way of doing things, even when the answers are maybe staring us right in the face, we are fixated on a specific way of doing that or addressing that. So thank you, because Tshepo, now we come to you. You spoke about the way that everyday capital, like capital needs to be in everyday people's hands. Maybe just demystify it for us, because I think it ties in so well with what Ntlai and Caesar have spoken about.
Thank you, Diana. And thank you, Caesar. Hopefully you all can hear me properly. It started to rain, but it's a good omen in Setswana, so hopefully this conversation is blessed. I mean, we everyone is talking about Africa like Africa is poor. Africa is not poor. I mean, the riches of Africa have always flowed out of Africa for centuries. Even if you take South Africa during the CODESA negotiations, the mining barons convinced Mandela that the minerals were not worth anything if they were not there. And in Africa, you'll hear these things about the Dutch disease, but you don't hear about the Dutch disease in the Gulf in no way. The problem is because of the pit to port model that we employ. We have the riches. So how do we change this? For us, is how do you put indigenous mine ownership and I will give you a simple example. More recently, you had a small copper from the UK, 30 billion. So I always say, if you had a local entity from Botswana or even a SADC or South African, whatever, at just 25%, they would have turned 8 million into 500 million. Even on a private equity 2 to 20, that is 100 million those people could actually have. That is a lot of capital that can be sort of put into different projects. So that's what we are struggling with. and we look at a copper belt right now, it presents this opportunity whereby you can create new capital ecosystems. Unless you have entrepreneurs with a lot of money, you don't really have capital ecosystems. It can be done. We have seen with Royal Bafokeng in South Africa. They started out by actually converting their royalties into equity. It gave them the transacting currency. They managed to sort of build their own mining company. With that, they expanded to control one of the largest banks in Africa. They're in healthcare, they're in education, they're in towers, they're in telecoms, they're in water, and all of these things. Their residual involvement in money is only a 10% stake in Northern. So I always say, before you talk about diversification, beneficiation, let us sort out this issue. Who owns these mines? Because unless you actually create that money, you make sure that the money actually starts to circulate within the particular communities, you cannot talk about anything down the line. So for us, we are putting together this capital pool that will enable this, what I call risk unlock of this money in tenements. Everyone is talking about sort of this transition. It's going to depend on copper. Africa has copper. Whether you go from the DRC, you go into Zambia, you go into Namibia, Angola, Botswana, and even South Africa, you have a lot of copper. So how do we unlock it as Africans? I think that's going to be key. If $1 that you put into a very early stage project actually unlocks about 20 or potentially even 40 or 100 types of value. So we need to be putting money into that. We
All
need
right. Mhm. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. Yes.
We need local capital to come to the party, because right now, what you tend to see is that in South Africa, they invest in the top 40 listed companies, whether it's standard or equity, but they will not do anything outside of that. They don't have allocation strategies in terms of what they do on a mining side. So you really desperately need that. Every mine that you see that was unlocked by the so-called merchant banks in the 90s and the 2000s, that capital is no longer there. Caesar's touched on it, because if I'm sitting in a bank, due to Basel III, if I held a $50 million position, I need to hold $50 million of capital. As you can see, just the arithmetic didn't work. But at the same time, you need all this capital that needs to come into the mining sector. E.g., just on the copper side, globally, you're going to need about 250 billion US dollars. But the AUM that sits in what you call specialist mining fund is only about 17 billion. And 0% of that does pre-feasibility project. Only 3% of that is comfortable with Africa. And what I'd like to sort of impress upon this is that when I talk about capital, I'm not talking about lending. The lending part is the easier part of the equation. How do I get to lending? Caesar mentioned the PPP that we are doing. The reason why we are able to unlock it, you have no sovereign involvement. It's a PPP. You have no sovereign involvement, but you have these blue chip institutions that are able to come on the active side. With that, you are able to prepare the project so that the DFIs can come in. So we need to talk a lot about this very early stage capital that needs to go into these projects. Otherwise, you have bankable projects, feasible projects that are not feasible because you don't have early stage capital. Thank you.
Okay. Tshepo, thank you so much for that. And I like the fact that you've actually touched on some of the key questions that we want to be addressed specifically when it comes to the early stage funding of early stage investments. And just jumping onto that next thought in terms of the fact that, and I'm just quoting what Dr. Gillian had said, systems change is a contact sport. Right? If you need to make the change, you have to do it through doing. And I think for me, that segues very well into what Ulili will be speaking towards when we speak about how do we also bring in capital into early stage investments. We've talked about the larger infrastructure needs, the mining, the roads. What about the systems, the change that we need to make so that we can also ensure that the micro, small, and medium enterprises that who are making the connections between people and services and goods. How do we actually support this early stage enterprises based on your experience? What should we do, especially to unlock that venture capital look? Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think the key thing to look at is when we imported venture into Africa, we brought along with it a lot of the errors that caused it to be not inclusive in America. So it was like who was the ones deploying capital. Again, it was a small group of elite people who not necessarily had access to, the same day-to-day experiences that the majority of people did. And the result of that was the folks who got invested in Africa, even though they were building businesses in Africa, most of the time these individuals were expats and not Africans who grew up on the ground and experienced day-to-day African life. And so something that I did while I was at Kapor Capital when building out our team of investors, it was making sure to build out a diverse team of investors. So our key problem that we were solving at Kapor was looking at the issues that low-income individuals face on a day-to-day basis, whether it be getting access to great healthcare, access to financial products. I think Caesar mentioned some of this in the beginning, or access to, the skills necessary to get better jobs. So we really recruited individuals who not only had that investing experience, but also had the life experience of either growing up in a low-income family, working for nonprofit organizations, et cetera, that address some of these issues that low-income folks face on a day-to-day basis. And so I think that's probably a start, is like changing the infrastructure of what venture looks like and who are those allocating capital, and making sure the folks on the ground allocating capital have knowledge of the issues that are facing local communities. Secondly, the venture infrastructure, it hasn't even worked for the US. A lot of the sovereign wealth funds, the pensions, foundations, et cetera, who've invested in venture have found themselves overweighted in venture because it takes so long to realize liquidity. So this is a 10 to 12 plus year cycle, and this usually requires a big event like a company IPOing or getting acquired by a larger entity. And so even within the US, what I've started seeing is a reworking of what we've considered venture and moving to new models such as, revenue-based financing, where a venture capitalist would invest a certain amount of money, and once a business starts receiving profits, they would return a percentage of their profits back to that entity, up to a certain amount. So 2x, 3x the original investment. This is great for businesses because it opens more businesses up to capital, whereas traditional venture cycles have only allowed these big businesses where $1 billion returns is possible. And then on the investor side, the great thing that has happened is it's allowed for a return of capital a lot quicker than traditional systems. And so, we can see more recycling of that capital because it's more likely that the company will reach profitability then they will IPO. So that is another thing I would say. And then going back to what Dr. Gillian said earlier, what Caesar mentioned in his talk, is it's really Africans investing in Africa. So, there is money on the continent. I mean, Dangote just passed. I think he has been labeled the richest Black person in the world. And so why is it, and not just to pick on him, but why is it that we are seeing a lot of these billionaire, Africans, Nigerians invest their money elsewhere, in Switzerland, in the US? How do we get more of them to invest back in the continent and, find entrepreneurs and founders like themselves and put their money and their time into building out the infrastructure there? That is one thing I think that does, in the US does get right, is like a lot of the founders, folks who've gone on to build these billion-dollar tech companies do invest in that next generation. And so if we saw more of that, I think there's more likelihood that we could build out the infrastructure.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ulili. And I really like what you have said, because it just lays the ground perfectly for what Amma and her team are doing in Ghana, specifically in terms of why aren't we seeing a lot of that pool of capital coming in to invest in opportunities that actually are there, abundantly there, and the fact that we need people who understand local nuance to really come in and unlock that trapped capital. So maybe Amma, over to you, and you could let us know some of the initiatives that are taking place in Ghana to really address some of these questions that are being raised during our discussions on why we still have that money flowing out instead of staying inside and investing in those SMEs.
Thanks so much, Diana. Thank you so much, Dr. Marcelle, for this opportunity, and to my colleagues here. Ghana has had a lot of press this week, this month, this year, this whole cycle of really trying to look inward around how we unlock capital. So I think the domestic capital mobilization is very much top of my agenda. My organization is Ghana Venture Capital and Private Equity Association. We work very closely with the Africa Venture Capital Association as well to drive that message home. So a lot of our time is really spent at the moment really building some of the fundamental structural foundations for the conversation around unlocking the capital, from pension funds in particular, but we're looking at insurance companies as well who are further behind. We have a very, very rich regulatory and policy environment. We have 20 years of venture capital and private equity in Ghana through our Venture Capital Trust Fund and Act. Very active, a lot of case studies that have emerged, which haven't really been told. So it's really the businesses that are, I would say, in quotes, boring, right? It's the hospitals, it's the schools. These are the ones that have actually successfully exited through venture capital and private equity investment. So I think it's really, we talk about tech and all the fanciful things, but I think that, again, going back to a previous speaker's point about the basics, the fundamentals of investing in the real touch points, the pain points of those who are experiencing acute challenges in their day-to-day lives. We all remember Mo Ibrahim's Celtel from the 90s, right? Africa was apparently too poor to afford mobile phone coverage. And we saw how he just innovated with postpaid, incremental cards that people could just access credit to call home and send money home. And now we have Momo, we have all these telecalls producing so many jobs, taxes, and pension contributions and all of those elements, jobs, because of that innovation that really opened up the African telecoms market. So I think it's really for us, number one, telling better stories around what has actually happened. We've had a lot of successful stories that we just haven't been able to package and put out there. And also the education piece, just the understanding of how we can innovate in the way that we blend our capital stacks, like Dr. Marcelle mentioned earlier. We need to, as Dr. Marcelle always says, widen the solution space. There are very many ways to sort of skin this cat of unlocking domestic capital. But I think that education piece, again, we do a lot of roundtables, one-on-one meetings with regulators, one-on-one meetings with policymakers, workshops, lunches, lunch and learns, mixers, social events, all of these to build the relational capital that is really required to unlock the basic understanding of the opportunity, right? And so, again, reframing the narrative around the fact that a lot of the financial returns, the outsized financial returns, will actually come from investing in impact, right? Impact and the key pain points that we talked about. And there is a growing body of evidence that overwhelmingly shows that, investing in impact isn't just a charity job, right? As we used to hear that narrative all the time, but it's actually something that can unlock outsized returns beyond the usual government bonds that most of our asset allocators are still very obsessed with. So I think that those are the key elements that I would like to share. And I would say that in terms of regulation and policy, we launched an industry-wide commitment to really hold some of our asset allocators accountable around the opportunity to basically sign up to do better, to commit to at least 5% of their assets under management to allocate towards this particular asset class of venture capital and private equity, in the sense that we want to do it, not the Silicon Valley model of blitzscaling and all these interesting terms that we've come to know and love. But again, the boring businesses, the businesses that would actually drive impact and create the jobs and solve real deep pain points around financial services, education, healthcare, the fundamentals, food systems, all of these things, renewable energy. These are the things that are real touch points for individuals, for businesses, and for the government as well. And so I would end by saying that we position ourselves as an ecosystem builder. We're very much active across various stakeholder groups. And we position ourselves as a partner to government, right? It's like we are here to partner with government to solve some of these really sticky problems in a way that can create jobs, generate taxes, and really unlock the next generation of pension and taxpayers in a predominantly young population and informal sector dominant marketplace. So that's my submission.
No, I really like that summary, and I think I want to bring it all together. And to be able to do that, I want to introduce our discussant, Olumide Lala, who is the co-founder and director of Climate Transition. And Olumide, if you can just speak, turn your video on and put on your microphone. We want to make this as engaging as possible, having had everything that the panelists have put together, whether it's the infrastructure needs, say for the mining, the roads, whether we are talking about how we need to build rails to unlock and deploy some of those local capital that needs to go into this, whether it's big projects or small opportunities in venture capital. What is it that really stands out at you from all the discussions that we've had with the panelists today?
Thank you very much, Diana. I guess the question is, where does one start? That has been very
a lot
riveting.
of good information has been shared.
Honestly,
yes.
I don't know which is hurting more, my ears or my hands. I've been writing so much. And now I've got to struggle to actually bring it all together. Starting with Dr. Philani, who obviously opened in his opening remarks, talked about solidarity, equality, and sustainability, and the importance of this. Talking about the fact that obviously just in this year alone, you've got over 130 working groups trying to solve issues that are pertaining to the issues that include things like food security, sustainable development, issues that actually typically mean so much to African development. There's one thing he says is talking about even the wealth and the breadth of the stakeholder that they've been discussing with, both in the global north and the global south, simply to unlock the strap capital to unlock a development agenda. And of course, what can I say? The keynote speech itself from Dr. Marcelle. Where do you start? Hardworking people just don't get the break. We have an African saying that even the Bible says to whom has more, much is given, and those to whom you don't have, it is taken away. It just seems like every single day we Africans face this issue of having so much taken away from us. They talk about aid being given to us, but when you net it out, most of the money is actually on its way out. Dr. Marcelle actually made reference to a number of things that actually got me thinking. The cost of capital in Africa remains very high. Why is this? Why is risk still being misappropriately being priced? Why is it so difficult to access capital? Why is lending so scarce for all the good things that we're doing? It cannot simply be because we are not developing the project properly. But at the same time, the population of Africa is rising. That is scary. I can't remember the last time we did a census in Nigeria, but it seems like every single year, as I can remember, over the last 10, 15 years, we went from 160 million. Today, if you talk to anyone, they'll tell you 260 million. It seems like we just keep having kids, but nobody's dying. So I'm trying to figure out where all these people are coming from. What the true population is, I don't know. But one thing I do know is resources is getting discussed, and the young people are coming after us because they're asking, where is my piece of the cake? All the people seem to be taking all the money, and I think it was Ulili or Amma who made reference to, we seem to be taking all the money and investing in Dubai, investing in Qatar, investing in Switzerland. What happens to investing in London? And we wonder why everybody is, the phrase Jackpot, yeah? I'm sure you've all heard it. Everybody wants to leave. The truth of the matter is, if we don't develop this place, they go over there. Who's going to fix this place? And to that point, Dr. Marcelle went really into talking about the triple B. That is very insightful. The fact that you spoke about three things. The first one, obviously, financial capital is an invaluable resource for Africa's development and survival, especially the word survival. When you talked about the bottlenecks, the barriers that are actually slowing and hindering capital mobilization and deploying processes. These are literally, as you said, structural processes. Now, it's important to actually think about that. We seem to be making policies and rules that just don't make sense to us, copying and pasting inappropriately, and we wonder why things are not working. We import people, who lack local knowledge as to how things should be done. And we wonder why money is not flowing. Pension funds. We need, and we keep talking about this, we need to develop more in continent capital. The pension funds, it's amazing. We talk about $200 trillion, but $200 trillion compared to $450 trillion is peanuts. But yet, there's a lot of money. How many countries actually put in place proper structures to get us to save adequately? A lot of the African countries still rely on government savings because they're the largest employer. But this needs to be managed by local professionals. I mean, we've been able to do that in Nigeria, I believe in Ghana as well. But, if you go to, obviously, South Africa and Kenya, but if you go to most of the African countries, we work for the government. The government puts money aside for us, but guess what? The government utilizes the money. And when you come to 60 and you retire, you find that inflation has eaten so much into your pension, you couldn't even afford to survive. And you wonder why people are dying so quickly after retirement. Yeah? We need to address this. Clearly, a small percentage, you said, not just in the global north, a small percentage of people hold on to the capital and continue to hold on to the capital, even on the continent. And sadly, they do not invest this in the continent. I mean, it's one thing I actually admire Dangote for. Say whatever you will about the man. At least he's investing his money on the continent. He's building things that people cannot build. We should have triple numbers of Dangote in every single country. The question is, why not? Why aren't we actually doing this? But the point that you made, cognitive blind spots, we are all guilty of it. All of us, including those of us sat in this room. Yeah? We are all beneficiaries and products of business schools from America, from the US, from UK, France, wherever. And then we come back and we wonder why the people at home don't understand us. Because we've been trained to think differently. No local knowledge, no local expertise. We got strategies that we developed in Harvard that don't tell you that you need to put money aside for generators to power your small stake industry. And you wonder why you're going out of business. There's a need to basically reorganize and restructure our educational system. We need to start looking inwards. How do you pass this knowledge to the next generation? So there's a need for multi-country programs. Somebody mentioned renewable energy just then, right? And we're actually looking to develop, I'm working with some entities in Nigeria to develop a program to fund that. And when I said to them, we need to put together $40 billion to install 20 gigawatts of power over the next 10 years, people looked at me like I'm mad. Now, obviously, to a Nigerian, 20 gigawatts of power sounds enormous if you haven't broken through 6 gigawatts over the last 40 years. But when I said that to an Indian, he looks like me. What are you talking about? That's child's play. We do that every single year. The question is, they've built a program. Why can't we do the same? Now, we're spending a lot of money today developing a sector that is probably the largest in Africa. And what are we doing? We're developing other people's economy. We're importing solar panels and batteries from China. Yet, I will say this to you. 40 years ago, when the Biafrans were fighting Nigeria, they built armored cars. You cannot tell me that they cannot build batteries. But yet, we refuse to invest in that. We'll rather go and buy batteries from China. We need to start thinking about different way of looking at this.
Yes, Olumide, we need to sort of...
The last point I will make,
yes.
The last point I will make, which comes from Dr. Marcelle, in terms of how we need to start looking at investing in the wealth of Africa. I would want to say this very quickly in closing. I picked up a number of things from the panel discussions from Ntlai, Tshepo, Caesar, Amma. You talked about availability of domestic capital, the pool of financial capital. One thing I actually didn't think about is we talk about government strangling private sector investors. One thing is this, they gather all this money into the budget. What happens to that unspent budget money? Where does it go? That's obviously crowded out. We could have used that throughout the year, but we never got to use it. So that's another thing we need to look at. I think I like what my good friend Caesar said about the experience you are beginning to have in working with the multilaterals. It's not all bad. There are good things that are being done. So there are multi-sector transactions that are being looked at in Zambia. We need to copy that. What are the things they're doing right so that we begin to do the same across Africa. Policy influence, extremely important. And I think I bring that back to my last speaker, who talked about the fact that, yes, we're doing a lot of policy stuff, we're changing stuff, and you've had 20 years experience in the venture capital sector in Ghana. But one thing we need to look at, Impact is not by talking, it's not by theory, it's in the doing. So we need to put more structures in place to actually begin to do. In East Africa, we say pole pole. Yeah? Let's do small,
Yes.
small, build on that, learn from it, and then build more. So I will end by saying this. The Triple B is Triple P framework is something that Dr. Mosiah has been talking to me about. She's educated me. I've learned so much. And everything that you guys have put together speaks to the fact that if we deploy that, leveraging sovereign funds, sovereign wealth funds, organizing ourselves in the same way that they've organized themselves with the Bahamas Sustainable Investment Program. If we do more of that, we're having conversations. I know that she's been having conversations with people like Rwanda, Botswana, even Senegal. If we do more of that, those of you in the room today are very influential people. Let's work with Dr. Marcelle. Let's see how we can deploy this program. Let's make Africa great again. Let's stop this Jackpot syndrome and let's turn, what we're doing to do, we're trying to solve for X. If X is 4, 1 plus 3 equals X. 5 minus 1 equals 4. 10 minus 6 equals 4. Let's focus on the 4. What is it we're trying to solve for? Let's work together. I like what you said, my brother, about being collaborative. Yeah, let's be collaborative. Let's think together and let's solve this problem. Let's make Africa great again. Africa first. Asante sana. Thank you very much. And God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Olomide. And on that high note, I just want to say we are so grateful for our panelists today. Just before we get into the question and answer sessions, if you have a question and answer, please put it into the Q&A section. But I just want to remind you, you have heard from awesome panelists today, starting with Ntlai Mosiah, who is the Executive Director of Autonomi Capital. We have also heard from Cesar Siwale, CEO of Pangaea Securities, together with his colleague Tshepo Magagane from Pangaea Securities. We also heard from Ulili Onovakpuri, who's a venture partner at Motley Fool Ventures. We've also heard from Amma, Gyampo, the CEO of the GVCA, that's a Ghana Venture Capital and Private Equity Association. We've just had an excellent summary from Olomide Lala, who is Executive Director, co-founder of Climate Transition Limited. Ladies and gentlemen, those were your panelists for today. And with that, I'd just like you to say you can either raise your hand or just put your question and answer into the Q&A box. We are really eager and looking forward to answering your questions. So happy to start. Okay, we have, I don't know if we have any raised hands or we just jump straight. Okay, no raised hand. Oh, there's a raised hand from one of the attendees. We have a raised hand from Dr. Malusi Ngube, and you can go first, and then Kenan Monroe. I think I saw your hand, or maybe you are okay. So maybe we can start with Dr. Malusi Ngube, and then we can go into the questions in the Q&A box. So over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Dr. Malusi. Hi, and how are you?
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for this session. It was very educational. I appreciated everything everyone said. My question is, number one, in terms of leadership, I hear all the technocratic things that you said about finance, investments, and all that. In terms of leadership, to push this whole revival, economic revival about Africa, in terms of leadership, what is it that we can learn from the Chinese? Because the Chinese, in 46 years, they've managed to be a world superpower, not only militarily, but economically and otherwise, in terms of finance, in terms of supply chains they've built, which they are now also using against the American in terms of their rare earth minerals. They're withholding because they are the only ones that have that monopoly. They had the foresight. And I want to support what Olomide said. And in South Africa here, we say, kancane, kancane, small, small. Chinese, they just did not build those supply chains in 1 day or in 10 years. It took them over 46 years. So I want to know from the whole group, when you leave today, what is going to be our supply chains we are going to build today? How are we going to piggyback on the normative success of the African Union in terms of how to make Africa great again? And piggybacking on what Olomide said, and also on the example that was given by Cesar Siwale. Cesar Siwale said something very very important about using our local currencies. And I'd like to say a window of opportunity, speak to that please, has opened whereby the BRICS, now we can use local currencies. We can use gold, we can use central banks, digital currencies, and other forms of money. I want to know from you, because you are our leaders here in Africa, what is our way forward from today? What is the product? What is the project that Alumide was speaking about that we're going to speak? Gangani. What are we going to learn from the Chinese? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malusi. So I'll read out the other two questions. Then we can allocate the responses to the panelists. So there's a question from Valerie Onu. She talked about Tshepo and the fact that you mentioned the use of PPPs and blue chip anchors to de-risk projects and attract DFIs. So what are the strategies to grow non-sovereign guarantees? And that's a very good question. And I believe we can have Dr. Gillian address that. So let me jump to the next question so that we can address the other questions as well and allocate. So Dr. Malusi's question, I'd also like to just mention that it would be great specifically to hear from CISA and maybe Amma specifically on what he has said on the issue of leadership, because Dr. Gillian had talked about governance and the importance of it, and the fact that you guys are working very closely with governments to be able to bring in all this investment into the various sectors that are needed. His question was, what can we learn, maybe not just from the Chinese, but from what other people are doing out there, so that we can be able to have a tangible action point? So maybe we can address that question first, and the question by Valerie, and which Dr. Marcelle will answer, and then we can go to the other questions. Sorry. On this issue, the question by Valerie, my apologies, we can request CISA to address it, because the question by Elise Marceline was specifically geared towards Dr. Marcelle. And it says that, thank you, Dr. Marcelle and the panelists, for your contributions. And I'll just jump right into her questions. Do you have recommendations on building cross-sector stakeholder buy-in to widening the solution space and innovating together? And what do you see as a role of the diaspora? So the first question on leadership and what we can learn from the Chinese and others, I'd like it to be answered by Amma and also Caesar. And then maybe Caesar, you can jump into the question to answer the question about the PPPs together with Tshepo. And then Dr. Marcelle, you can answer the question in the Q&A from Elise. And then we can continue to address the other questions. So let's take those three, and then we can continue to address the other questions. So over to you, Amma, Caesar, Tshepo, and Dr. Gillian.
Okay, I would just say that convenings like these are really important for us to have that kind of, cross-continental conversations in terms of, different countries, diaspora influences. We all have various leadership roles in our day-to-day. So I think we need to be doing more of this, West Africa, South Africa, North, South, like all of us coming together in this kind of format, sharing ideas and experiences in a very intentional way. I think that is where we can unify and sort of streamline some of our efforts towards what we want to see as our outcomes. So that would be my contribution to that last question.
Is this over Caesar? To me in terms of the leadership Caesar? Question? Yeah,
yes, and maybe, sorry, after you, we can just have a quick snippet from Dr. Philani as well. I just realized we still have him on the call. Over to you.
Okay, but I'll try and just get both 2 points out of the way, including the PPPs, if that's okay. But just specifically on the leadership point, I think you're spot on, right? I mean, we're using words more and more like ecosystem in our office here, and it's the sum of the parts, from the communities that we all seem to talk to, like the need saving, but also to the leadership, the people that are running the countries. And there's a trend that we're seeing taking place at the moment in various countries that doesn't help the cause, right? because we can't sit here and say, well, why is this particular citizen in one country who's got capital afraid to invest across the border? And then 90 days before an election or afterwards, the whole country falls apart or it's shut for multiple days, goods can't move. And that 5-10 days that country shuts down, it's got fundamental impact if you're in the middle of some of these initiatives, and especially the infrastructure ones that are quite substantial. So that's a very high level view. Those are at a very senior level. So I'm not talking about the projects, them specifically, but at a very senior level. Those are things that these bodies that we have, the so-called AU and others, they need to hold to account because they make the whole system fall apart. But also specifically, I've always heard about United States of Africa. We can barely figure ourselves out in country. And so my view, and my colleagues know, I'm super obsessed with SADC. Sorry to West Africa and East, but this is our backyard and it makes sense. Have 4 or 5 blocks and make them work. SADC is so rich, and combined with 350, 400 million people. Yes, we all have our own version of country risk, but it's de-riskable, right? And we're already seeing the certain elements that we're already over-integrated. So if you look at the electricity infrastructure, SAP, the Southern African Power Pool, it's only separated by these artificial borders. Otherwise, it's really one big super grid. And that seems to work with its own nuances, but it seems to work. But I always get baffled when the Zambians or the Tanzanians, even the South Africans, cry when they're having load shedding. Why are you selling power into Zambia? But there's nuances that platform has to be balanced and has to keep working. So I think that is important. I think we have to be less of talk shops. We should be first in line. I know the EU and the American policy on critical minerals better than the SADC one. I haven't seen it. I'm sure there's one somewhere, but it's not the one we speak to. In January this year, it was pretty much illegal with any African financial institution to get funding to do a coal project. It seems coal is now back because of the type of leadership they've got in Washington, D.C. So whose narrative are we driving? 3 weeks ago, there was an issue about rare earths. Suddenly today, everybody in Southern Africa is looking for rare earths because there's this geopolitics happening between. So I think we need to figure out what is our playbook and where is it that we want to move to. And if we have all these minerals, why is Zambia signing MOUs with all those different places, but we're not putting together MOUs as a block within the region so that we do more beneficiation here before we ship them out? What is South Africa doing with how it deploys its capital? Because the reality is the deepest pools of capital on the continent in that country. So from my perspective, that is one huge distinguishing factor that China as a single country and have had a single strategy for the last 40 years. We are inconsistent. Where I saw it really play out was Zambia and South Africa's fight for the leadership at the African Development Bank. It was the most bizarre thing that I experienced. I don't understand the politics. I speak as a very simple, naive person looking in, but trying to enable for various clients that we represent. And I should say, just to sort of wrap up on this, it was a really important point. I should say again, we should never, because as we say, pangono, slowly, right? I should say again, that in my journey, how I've seen the transformation, and there is more African participation, even in a small economy like Zambia, relative, say, to Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, you can see the uplift of people that are trying to participate. Our job is to enable for them. And those people and their leadership in those entities, they're trying to make these things work. And how do we de-risk? Zambia right now, as you know, is under a DSA program. Yet Zambia has got a GDP growth this year earmarked at 6.8%, right? Somebody who's sitting in London with a Harvard Business School training or LSE, the two don't make sense. They're very much at odds with each other. So there's many nuances that are in there. And then that indirectly, just to wrap up, it also speaks to the question about the PPPs. The PPPs that we're working on, we've ensured that they're privately driven, and we've utilized corporates in country, in particular the mining companies, to de-risk, where we get a mining company commit traffic to the road, use it or pay. where some of the large entities have come forward and they have done the project prep in a proper manner, because we see many individuals who know the right people, as it was raised earlier. They have a concession, but they don't have even $10 to go and pay for the fee for the concession. So they cannot go through that project prep exercise. And so we've been very lucky in what we choose, and so that we've got the right cookie cutters that we can show that actually if you do it this way, it works. And you've found it's been very well received. These initiatives are bankable. We've done all the ESG stuff, IFC principles, all the heavy stuff that also make it very expensive for us. But we recognize because we're doing it pangono, where we are in our journey, we have to do those things with an intent down the line that we de-risk. That we've got the African multilaterals playing along, and we've got the likes. Somebody talked about ECIC. They are coming on board. There's certain requirements they have, which are usually onerous. We've been able to negotiate those down because they've seen we've done the heavy lifting. So I think the question of leadership, it's at multiple levels. It applies to the PPPs, but ultimately, who starts holding SADC, AGOA, AU, and all these various other bodies that are there accountable? And maybe one day there's a consolidation of the 4 or 5 of them, and you have a United States of Africa, and maybe then the conversation is different, right? But to do it in one shot, we'll see. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Before we jump into the next question, I really thought, Dr. Philani, you'd really like to jump in and explain how we can use the T20 platform to address this issue of leadership, because I think your platform provides us with that opportunity before we jump into the next question.
Yeah, no, colleagues, just very briefly, I think, obviously, I think what's important is at the side of the T20, I think the advantage that this engagement group has, it is able to be actively engaged with all the other 13 engagement groups. So there's 13 official engagement groups, but there's a lot more unofficial engagement groups. And I think as the ideas bank, essentially, of the G20 ecosystem, it allows us to move in and out of the various discussions, whether it's the business 20, the labor 20, women's 20, and to bring all of these, different thinkers and practitioners together in such a platform. And I think that is a value addition, because you are bringing practitioners and you're bringing, scholars together. So that's something that from our side, what we've also done intentionally is to work much closer with African think tanks, throughout the year. At times with the support of the presidency through the office of the deputy president. And so I think that's something that the T20 has tried to contribute. I think a last point, sort of leading from what Dr. Mthembu said, it goes back to what also Dr. Marcelle was saying. We have to, overcome the barrier that is mental. The manner in which we assess risk, the manner in which we think about how to spread the risk also. I think we need to be less averse to experimentation. The reality is that the economic systems that we inherited, many of our countries, were not designed to develop our countries. So if we keep operating from within those particular frameworks, the reality is that you will perpetuate inequality, underdevelopment. And so many of the new ways many of the ways to resolve the challenges we have will not come from the textbooks. They will come from the practitioners that are involved at a day-to-day basis on the ground, finding solutions. And therefore, we need to also experiment at a small scale, see whether things function, and then be able to scale them up. And by doing that, we gradually overcome, this risk-averse culture that we have inherited. And I think to a larger point, this is what also Dr. Mthembu, the Chinese, in their approach of, crossing the river by feeling the stones, this is exactly what they were doing. And this is also what they were doing by saying white cat, black cat, if it catches the mouse, it's a good cat. So we have to experiment, and we have to do it gradually and overcome that mental that mental blockage. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Dr. Gillian, over to you to answer Elise's questions.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'll be brief. The role of the diaspora in contributing to the economic revolution. Well, first we have to be sure that the diaspora has the right intention and also the right understanding of what the revolutionary goals are. Because from my lived experience of being a person from the diaspora and having lived on the continent, I have questions around that. And so I think that it ties into the question that Richard Venegar asked. Richard, I am a fan, I'm a great admirer of you and other African American investors who have done well, reasonably well in their own setting. But I have doubts as to whether or not those two groups are ready to work in solidarity with each other unless we have bridges. Because there is too much and it's too easy for diasporans to believe that they are coming to save Africa. And I know that the folks in Southern Africa will simply be polite and not show up, while the Nigerians will be arrogant and tell them about their family. But I'm being serious in that we cannot assume the directionality of that contribution. So it is work that has to be done. And speaking for, the folks in the Caribbean, I've been making speeches that speak about what the Caribbean needs to learn from Africa for the last 20 years. And these folks in really tiny countries are not prepared to hear that because they're still thinking about continental Africa from a Western frame. So I understand what I think is the spirit behind the question because I know you, Elise. But I think it's one that maybe we need to have another webinar about because it's not an easy thing to do. But it is my post-retirement project so that this is what I'll be doing, right? Once I'm not doing this stuff, I will be working on that exchange and that connection between all of Africa, wherever we find ourselves as global Africa. And then the first question, I think in terms of the building of cross-sector stakeholder buy-in, I think that we have experts on the panel who spoke to that. Follow Amma, follow Diana, because that's what they do, right? That's their day-to-day job of making sure that institutional players understand that they can benefit from having respectful conversations with different stakeholders. And those dinners and lunches that Amma spoke about, those are so important, so key to actually making the ecosystems enabling for capital to flow in various sizes and quanta and into different sectors. So thanks for those two very thoughtful questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gillian. I think we have so many questions. We are running out of time, so we will take two more questions from the audience and then two more questions from the Q&A, and allow me to combine certain questions. There's a question about how can domestic institutional players, the pension fund insurers, be incentivized to allocate to revenue-based financing vehicles that recycle local currency capital and deepen domestic liquidity. And I want to tie that into your second question, Valerie, on how do we create local incentives for successful founders and local high net worth individuals to reinvest into regional pooled funds so as to build the domestic investor funnel. So Ntlai and Olumide, would you want to take those two questions before we open up for the last two questions from our audience? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and go before Olumide because he's wiser than
That's
me.
a wise strategy. That's a wise strategy.
He has to go last, otherwise I'll have nothing to say. So let me grab all my knowledge and try and contribute here. So on pension funds, I think this has been an exercise that's been embarked upon by several people over the past 5, 7, 10 years. I think Dr. Marcelle mentioned some ex-colleagues of mine from Standard Bank, Lindecker, for example, who've been on this journey. And it does seem as if that ecosystem just needs to be cracked open a little bit. You know, you've got the pension funds, you've got the trustees of those pension funds. There's a lot of work going into trustee education. Then you've got the advisors to those, what they call the consultants into those pension funds. So that needs to be cracked open. And there's always a lot of legislation. And some of them you'll find are working from legislation from like 40 or 50 years ago. So in SA, there's been a big push to introduce alternative assets, but that has taken a lot of education. For example, the renewable energy program in South Africa has been reasonably successful, and a lot of the pension funds have gone into that, but they haven't necessarily gone into other infrastructure and energy assets to be able to open up. So I think a lot of work is going in there, and but it's incumbent upon investment professionals to always be designing the products that will be appealing to that pension fund. So we almost need to be meeting each other halfway, and I think somewhere there a lot of that doesn't quite happen the way it should. Yeah, over to the more wiser Mr. Lalo over there.
You're putting more pressures on me, yeah? But it's okay. I think to your question, pension funds and patient finance, if you will, especially in the countries. I mean, if I look at Nigeria, for instance, we've got various rules, right, that limit the percentage allocation into various things, and that comes literally from a fear factor, if you will, managing the risk. But the same pension regulator allows the pension funds to throw all this money at the government, which in my opinion is probably not the wisest thing. They tell you it's risk-free. I guess nobody ever gets fired for buying IBM, they tell me in tech. And so no fund manager gets fired for giving money to the sovereign. But then the sovereign devalues your investment by printing money, and then devalues your currency, and then gives you less than inflationary rates, and everybody seems to be happy. I don't know how that works. But I guess to your point, we seem to, sadly, everything South Africa does, we seem to copy. 15 years ago, I was asked to go and create a tool for securities lending, and we copied and pasted badly because we didn't realize that you guys had a 5-day settlement period, whilst we had a 3-day settlement period. I wonder why the damn thing didn't work. So you learn from experience. But let's look at things in modern day. You talked about alternative investment opportunities. If you look at just the energy sector right now, the sustainable and renewable energy in terms of even solar energy, right? The opportunity is immense. But we also know that no pension fund is just going to throw its money at this sector, because to a large extent, the sector itself needs the de-risking, in its a bit of subsidy support and all that kind of stuff. But we need to put a program in place. We know what the end game is. The pension funds are only allowed to invest in market-ready, market-tradable securities. So what we need to do is literally put the framework in place that allows you to de-risk these opportunities. Early capital, as I think it was Caesar that mentioned earlier on, early capital that goes in. We've got some monies coming from all over the place right now to de-risk this sector as grants. Utilize that grant, rather than 1 for 1. This is what we're actually building up right now. Try and stretch it to 1 to 10. Use it to de-risk, attract early investment, and then build that up to attract, bankable projects by doing proper preparation. Once you prepare the project, you de-risk it adequately. You understand what the private sector capital investor or lender needs. Integrate that into this framework, and then you can then take that to market. with the view that there's an exit strategy through the capital markets. I mean, I spent 3 years building, developing the capital markets, green bonds capital markets in Nigeria. And we only issued one banking commercial issuance and a couple of other issuance in 4 or 5 years. It makes no sense. Yet, all of these banks are receiving funds from DFIs every single day in dollars. And you think, how is that possible? We just talked about matching local currency from local receipts. You can securitize local currency receipts into the market. But if you take in dollars, you got to pay back dollars. Now, if I had taken dollars in Nigeria 2 years ago at 750 to 1, it's now 1,700. I'm gone. It's just not viable. So we need to start focusing on how do we use local money to do this. But in order to attract the pension fund, we've got to do the work first. That's one thing we don't do enough of. We're very transactional based. And this is one thing I like about the Triple B. It's more strategic in its focus. It looks at the impediments, what hinders it, and then puts a focus, a long-term strategy. How do you build this? And that's basically what we're trying to do here within that sector. It takes a while. It takes a lot of effort. But, we need to do that, essentially. And that's how we will attract the money.
Okay. Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we are 15 minutes over. We have to come to a close. I'm really sorry if we were not able to answer all your questions, but I'm sure we will be sharing some material from this. We'll get confirmation on whether we are sharing the recording as well. I just want to take this opportunity for saying thank you for being such an awesome audience. You've been answering, asking a lot of questions. You've given us comments and feedback. We really love this. And thank you for taking your time to join us today from wherever you are. In East Africa, we are about to start saying good night for those of us who are millennials, but we have had the energy to continue because the discussions were so rich. So allow me to just hand over back to Dr. Philani and Dr. Gillian to take it all the way from here. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, colleagues. I'll be very brief. I think this has been such a rich engagement. I think this is also, just to say, let this be an open invite to say, while South Africa holds the presidency of the G20 this year, the issues discussed are not necessarily confined to South Africa's presidency. They will remain relevant moving forward. And with that, I think I would love to see, greater engagement with the likes of Resilience Capital and the organizations and structures that were represented today by the speakers. Let's create more platforms where we bring the best in terms of practitioners and scholars working to solve challenges rather than simply to diagnose them. Let us bring those examples of what works, what doesn't work. Let us continue to take it to policymakers and to practitioners. And therefore, let this official side event not be a standalone, once-off side event, but let it be the beginning of a longer-term engagement. And with that, thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Philani. I'm going to take a few minutes simply to do what I think is the most important job, which is to thank a number of people without whom this would simply have been impossible. So let me start with Asander Negosheng, and who helped us with media relations. There was Johannes Prosper and Dalton Adams, who came in at absolutely, I don't know whether it's the 11th and a half minute to help us with management of the technical aspects. There is Aloha Media Production and Jupiter Stone, who's going to be making sure that we can get the takeaways from this event and the program of action that arises from it to the world, and specifically to young people, to Gen Zers who really like multimedia formats. From the in terms of the graphics that you've been seeing, I want to thank Mark Dutlow from the incredibly named Incredible Humans Africa. And I also want to thank Dr. Anne McKenna for helping with some of the underlying research. In terms of the RCV team, please let me name them because without them, it would have not been possible. Elias Chikoto, Michaela, Shireen Badat, Rossi, Adrian Antoine, who is a new person who is assisting with this event. From the point of view of the engagement with the T20 Secretariat and with Institute for Global Dialogue, I simply want to add a really heartfelt thank you to you, Dr. Mthembu, for sticking with this as a theme from a substantive point of view, but also from a method in terms of being wise enough to understand that the Ideas Bank also needed to hear from and to engage with practitioners. And so I really, really thank you for that. And finally, last but not least, your team has been extremely gracious and patient. And so I want to thank Mr. Kenny Silauli from your team at IGD for the assistance and cooperation that we have enjoyed. So thanks to everyone who's made this possible. And of course, the moderator did yeoman's work. So let me add a special thanks to Diana Gichaga and to all the fantastic panelists who I think were thanked individually by her because their brilliance was on display for everyone to see. Thank you very much, colleagues, and we welcome and invite your continued involvement in this agenda.